Hey guys, my name is Katie Fredrickson, and in today's video, I'm going to share with you a definitive tool list for everything you need to sew swimwear. I'm going to make it very clear what things you absolutely need versus what things you can make do without. In the description, there's going to be a blog post with links to every product that I mention. So if you want to use the exact tools that I'm using or ones that I recommend, that blog post will have all the links you need. So let's just go through one by one. The first category is sewing machines and sergers. First, you will need a sewing machine and possibly a serger too. One of the most common questions I get asked is, do you need a serger to sew swimwear? No, you don't need to have a serger because instead of using an overlock stitch on that machine, you can use a zigzag stitch on a regular machine. However, the two are not created equal. An overlock stitch is going to be better quality, it's going to make your garment look a lot more professional, it's going to be much faster, and overall, if you can have a serger, you should get one. So you don't need one in order to start with swimwear, but if you can, then it's definitely something worth investing in. The second most common question I get is, can I buy a serger instead of buying a regular sewing machine and then just use a serger? If you're making reversible swimwear or swimwear with concealed seams, you can get away with just a serger. That just means you'll need to hand stitch the final hole that's left over. Plus, a serger can't do a top stitch, so that limits the types of styles you can do. For instance, if you only had a serger, you wouldn't be able to do a basic string triangle bikini top because that requires a top stitch. And there's some other areas where I personally just prefer to use a sewing machine, like attaching the sides or straps, and I also use basting stitches a lot. So for me personally, a sewing machine is necessary. Ideally, you would use both a regular sewing machine as well as a serger, but I know that's not in everyone's budgets or space, so if you had to choose just one, I would start off with the regular sewing machine. Another machine question that comes up is, do you need a cover stitch machine? If you're making reversible swimwear or swimwear with concealed seams, then no. If you're making non-reversible swimwear, then I do think it'd be a nice tool, but it's definitely not necessary. The serger that I have converts into a cover stitch machine, and I can count how many times I've used it in the past 5 years on one hand. And the machines that I use are the Pfaff Ambition 620 for my regular machine and a Baby Lock Evolution for my serger. Thread. Now, what thread do you need? I recommend using a high quality polyester thread, whether you're using it on a regular sewing machine or a serger. Please don't roast me if I butcher this pronunciation, but the thread that I use is called Gutermann Mara 120. It's definitely an investment, but so far I can say it is absolutely worth it. With thread, I really do believe that it's worth the investment, especially if you're making it for other people or you just want your garments to last a long time. And I'm not saying you need to get the most expensive thread out there, but definitely take a look at reviews and just get an idea of what is a good brand versus what is one that could use a little more quality. Elastic. I made an entire video series all about elastic, so I'm going to save you from all that spiel and just direct you over to that playlist. Check the link in the description for that. Do you absolutely need it? It depends. So go watch part 1 of the elastic series and that video will answer that question in further detail. But in summary, I think you should. I use 1/4 inch rubber elastic for everything. Also in this category is an elastic foot, and I made a video on that topic too, so if you're wanting a more thorough overview, then go check that out. Again, it's gonna be one of those things that you don't absolutely need, but it is very, very nice to have. Needles. For needles, I recommend using either ballpoint or stretched needles. Ballpoint needles are also sometimes called jersey needles. This is pretty straightforward. They're pretty easy to find online or in a sewing shop. Needles can surprisingly be the root of a lot of issues, so I'd say that having the correct needles is a necessity. Now we're gonna go through some miscellaneous tools that really don't have their own category, but they are very helpful and necessary. First, a seam ripper. In reversible swimwear, I use this tool to make a hole in an existing seam, which then through that hole, I take everything to the right side so that all the seams get tucked in and are all concealed. So the seam ripper is the tool that helps me do that. Plus, it's good to have one of these around because we are all bound to mess up at some point. So a seam ripper, I would say, is a necessity. Pins. So I actually switched to clips instead, and for me those are perfect. I use them often and they absolutely come in handy. So pins or clips I would say are necessary. But if you want to save money and not go buy something new, instead of pins you can use something like binder clips. Next is a loop turner. This is a little device that helps you turn your straps from inside out to right side out. This is a very handy little tool, and there are a bunch of different versions of this same tool out there. Overall, it doesn't really matter what you get, but it is a necessity. Again, if you don't want to buy anything new, a cheap alternative is using a safety pin instead. But a loop turner is much faster and overall much more efficient, especially for long straps. Scissors. This one should be pretty obvious. This is a necessity for sewing. Now, I don't use scissors to cut my fabric. I use a rotary cutter, which I'm gonna get into next. But I do use scissors for things like cutting elastic, trimming seam allowances, and cutting the pattern itself. I use two different types of scissors. One are these really nice heavy-duty fabric scissors, and then I have another pair of scissors that's meant for cutting paper or anything non-fabric. And you want to be careful not to use your fabric scissors on anything but fabric, otherwise it's going to dull them much quicker. That being said, I'm a total hypocrite because I use my fabric scissors for everything. Rotary mat and cutter. So this is how I cut my fabric. The rotary cutter is this little handheld rolling thing with a very sharp blade. And I laugh at that because I've cut myself many times. And this mat is a necessity to go with the cutter because the mat is self-healing and it won't scratch. If you did this on your kitchen table, you would ruin it. So as far as if a rotary mat and cutter are a necessity, I would say no, because you could just use scissors instead. However, for the fastest and most accurate cutting experience, this set is so worth it. And if you do decide to go with a rotary mat and cutter, then make sure you order some replacement blades at the same time. The blades do dull relatively quickly, which can make the cutting harder and more dangerous. I replace my blades once every few weeks, so it is nice to have an extra pack or two on hand. I also want to mention that there is a bit of a learning curve learning how to use a rotary cutter. So take it very slow, be very careful, and practice as much as you can. Because when you do get the hang of it, you will never go back to scissors. Acrylic ruler. So this tool I'd say only get if you have a rotary cutter. With scissors, it won't work as well. I use an acrylic ruler to cut straps and bands and anything that's going to be rectangular. It's another one of those tools that's not a necessity necessarily, but I can't imagine my life without it. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about two things that you might want if you plan on modifying patterns. If you don't plan on modifying or redrawing any patterns, then don't worry about this section. However, just with patterns in general, there is no one size fits all. So I do recommend just learning how to modify and getting comfortable with it. Pattern paper. You'll want this when you want to copy an existing pattern onto another piece of paper where then you can make the modifications. For some changes, you can make them directly on the pattern, but for instance, if you're wanting to make a larger size, you're gonna need more paper. This paper is cheap and it's just really nice to have on hand. But I don't use roll paper anymore. Instead, I use sheets of computer paper, like I am reading off of now. Once I print it on both sides, I will tape them together and use them to modify patterns. That way you can repurpose some paper before it gets recycled. Next are fashion rulers. These are some very handy little tools that are fantastic for drawing smooth curves and lines. They're very affordable. You can get a pack of 4 for 10 bucks. And when you're pattern making or modifying a pattern on paper, these are very helpful for that. So that completes the list. Again, there's a blog post with links to all of this stuff as well as a checklist. And that is linked in the description. If you have a question on a particular tool that wasn't mentioned, drop a comment below and we can kind of figure out whether it's necessary or if it could be helpful. If you're not already, go follow Edgewater Avenue on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Also consider joining our Facebook group. There are 4,000 swimwear sewers who give each other advice and share project photos and ideas, business tips. All of that is in that group, so definitely consider joining. And thank you for making it to the end. I'll see you next time.